April 1941. A quiet airfield outside Tokyo. The aircraft on the tarmac does not look like a weapon of war. Its lines are smooth, civilian, designed for passengers, not bombs. Engineers walk slowly around it, studying the wings, the fuselage, the engines, clipboards in hand, expressions guarded. This machine was never meant to be here. Across the Pacific, American manufacturers had already dismissed the design. It failed to meet expectations. Performance was lacking. Its future as a military platform was quietly abandoned. Japan saw opportunity. In an era defined by urgency and ambition, the aircraft promised something Japan desperately needed: range, payload, and speed on paper. Converted, strengthened, and armed, it was meant to become a heavy bomber, capable of striking far beyond Japan's shores. Expectations were high. But as test flights began, reality intruded. Engines strained under new weight, handling degraded, performance figures failed to match projections. Each modification introduced new problems. Each solution exposed another weakness. What had looked adequate on paper began to reveal its limits in the air. Japanese planners did not abandon the project immediately. Too much had already been invested. Too much hope had been placed in the idea that adaptation could overcome design. Instead, they pressed on, and in doing so, Japan committed itself to an aircraft that would quietly embody a deeper problem, one that could not be solved by urgency or ambition alone. To understand how this decision was made and why it unfolded the way it did, it is necessary to step back, before the failures in the sky, to the strategic pressures that drove Japan to buy what America had already rejected. By the late 1930s, Japan's aviation ambitions were colliding with hard limits. The empire was expanding rapidly across East Asia, and military planners understood that modern war would be decided not only by soldiers and ships, but by air power capable of reaching far beyond front lines. Japan needed long-range bombers. The problem was that Japan had never truly mastered the art of building them. Japanese aircraft design excelled in one area: lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters, optimized for range and agility. Bombers were another matter entirely. Heavy bombers demanded powerful engines, strong airframes, advanced metallurgy, and a deep industrial base capable of producing complex components at scale. These were areas where Japan lagged behind the United States. American aviation firms had spent the 1930s experimenting, failing, and refining. Designs were tested, rejected, and improved in an environment where industrial capacity allowed for iteration. When a civilian airliner failed to meet expectations, whether due to performance, reliability, or structural limits, it was set aside without strategic consequence. Japan did not have that luxury. As tensions with the United States and Britain intensified, Japanese planners searched for shortcuts. Foreign designs offered the promise of speed. A purchased airliner could be studied, adapted, and transformed into a military aircraft without years of costly development. On paper, the logic made sense. A civilian airliner already possessed range. Its fuselage could, in theory, carry bombs instead of passengers. Its wings could be strengthened. Defensive armament could be added. What America had discarded as commercially unviable might still serve Japan's wartime needs. But civilian design priorities differed fundamentally from military ones. Airliners were built for efficiency, comfort, and steady cruising, not for surviving flak, carrying heavy ordnance, or operating from rough airfields under combat stress. Structural margins were thinner, power reserves were limited. Modifying such an aircraft meant fighting against its original design at every step. Japanese engineers understood this in theory. In practice, they were under immense pressure. By 1940, Japan faced embargoes, material shortages, and shrinking access to foreign technology. Indigenous heavy bomber programs struggled with underpowered engines and manufacturing inconsistencies. Each delay threatened Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. So when the opportunity arose to acquire an American airliner that had failed to impress its original designers, it appeared to offer a solution born of necessity. The decision was not driven by ignorance, it was driven by urgency. And urgency has a way of narrowing options until compromise feels like progress. What Japan purchased was not a miracle aircraft, it was a starting point, one that American engineers had already judged inadequate for their own purposes. Yet in Tokyo, hope remained that adaptation could succeed where original intent had failed. That belief would soon be tested not in meetings or blueprints, but in the unforgiving space between runway and sky. Once the decision was made, the aircraft's transformation began under conditions that left little room for doubt or delay. Japan's engineers were tasked with turning a civilian airliner, designed for reliability and efficiency, into a heavy bomber capable of operating in contested airspace. The challenges emerged immediately.
The airframe, originally optimized for steady cruising, struggled under the added weight of armor, bomb racks, and defensive guns. Reinforcing the structure increased mass faster than engine output could compensate. Performance calculations that looked acceptable in theory unraveled during testing. Engines ran hotter, takeoff distances grew longer, climb rate suffered. Range shrank as fuel consumption rose. Each solution introduced another problem. Strengthening the wings stressed the fuselage. Adding defensive armament increased drag. Modifying internal layouts disrupt balance. Engineers were forced into constant compromise, choosing which weaknesses were acceptable and which might prove fatal. American manufacturers had encountered similar problems earlier and abandoned the design. They possessed alternatives. Japan did not. By 1941, the aircraft entered limited service, carrying expectations it could not meet. On paper, it promised range and payload sufficient for strategic bombing. In practice, it struggled to deliver either with unacceptable risk. Operational commanders noticed immediately. Maintenance demands were high, reliability was inconsistent. Crews reported handling difficulties under combat load. Missions planned at maximum range left little margin for error. Still, the aircraft was deployed. Japan's strategic situation offered no pause. The war expanded rapidly. The need for long-range striking power grew urgent. Despite its shortcomings, the bomber was pressed into service because there was nothing else ready to replace it. What began as a hopeful adaptation became a reluctant dependency. Within Axis planning circles, expectations quietly shifted. The aircraft was no longer seen as a decisive tool, but as a stopgap, a compromise forced into roles it had never been meant to fill. Yet even as doubts grew, the full cost of this decision had not yet revealed itself. That would come only when theory collided with combat, and the bomber faced conditions it could not absorb. The moment of reckoning was approaching, shaped not by dramatic failure, but by the slow accumulation of shortcomings that no amount of urgency could erase. From the moment it left the drawing board, the aircraft was at odds with its new role. Civilian airliners were built to minimize stress, not absorb it. Their structures were optimized for smooth, predictable flight profiles, not abrupt maneuvers, evasive action, or combat damage. As a bomber, this aircraft carried loads its designers had never intended. Bomb bays cut into the fuselage weakened internal integrity. Reinforcements added weight without adding proportional strength. The result was an aircraft constantly operating near its limits. In combat conditions, this mattered. Turbulence, evasive turns, and uneven loads amplified structural stress. Crews learned quickly that the aircraft demanded careful handling. Aggressive maneuvers risked damage that could not be repaired in the air. Angle 2. Power without margin. The engines were adequate for civilian service, they were not generous. Once burdened with armor, weapons, and bombs, the aircraft lost its performance buffer. Climb rates fell, takeoffs became dangerous on short runways. Engine failures left little room for recovery. American designers had already identified this limitation. Without more powerful engines, the aircraft could not safely meet military demands. Japan lacked both the engines and the time to redesign the platform fundamentally. Operationally, this translated into caution. Missions were planned conservatively, payloads were reduced, ranges were shortened. The bomber existed, but it could not deliver what had been promised. Angle 3. Crews caught between expectation and reality. Air crews felt the consequences most directly. Training emphasized careful flight rather than aggressive tactics. Pilots learned to avoid combat whenever possible, knowing the aircraft could not absorb punishment. Morale suffered quietly. Crews understood they were flying a machine that had been compromised from the start. Confidence eroded not through fear, but through familiarity with the aircraft's limitations. What had been envisioned as a strategic asset became a liability that demanded constant accommodation. And as these realities settled in, the aircraft's role shifted, not through official announcement, but through operational necessity, setting the stage for a broader reckoning with what Japan had hoped this bomber would become. Japanese bomber doctrine assumed that range alone could compensate for vulnerability. If an aircraft could fly far enough, it could strike targets beyond immediate retaliation. This assumption held only if the bomber could survive interception and return intact. The converted airliner could not. Its speed was insufficient to outrun fighters. Its defensive armament was limited by weight and power constraints. Its structural fragility discouraged evasive action. In theory, it could reach distant targets. In practice, it could not do so safely once enemy opposition appeared. American planners had already recognized this flaw when they abandoned the design. Japan learned it only after committing to the aircraft. Angle 5. Industrial reality exposed. Every weakness in the bomber reflected a larger problem. Japan lacked high-output engines in sufficient numbers. Advanced alloys were scarce. Manufacturing tolerances varied. Each shortcoming compounded the others. Unlike the United States, Japan could not discard a failing design and move on. Production continued not because the aircraft worked, but because stopping would leave nothing in its place. The bomber became a symbol of constraint rather than capability. Angle 6. The quiet loss of strategic faith. There was no dramatic announcement declaring failure. Instead, confidence eroded quietly. Missions were reassigned. Expectations lowered.
The aircraft was used where opposition was light, and withdrawn where danger was high. Strategic bombing ambitions faded not with defeat, but with resignation. Japanese command began to understand that buying what America had rejected did not grant American capability. It only revealed how far behind Japan's aviation industry truly was. This realization did not end the war, but it marked a turning point in how Japan viewed its own air power, setting the stage for the moment when theory would finally collapse under combat reality. The moment of reckoning did not arrive in a single catastrophic crash or a single failed mission. It arrived gradually, through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of reports that told the same story again and again. By late 1942, the aircraft was being deployed in operational environments it could not control. Enemy fighters were faster, anti-aircraft fire was heavier, weather over long routes magnified mechanical stress. Each sortie exposed the same weaknesses. Crews returned with engines overstressed, structures fatigued, and performance margins nearly exhausted. Some aircraft failed to return at all, not always because they were shot down, but because they could not endure the demands placed upon them. Commanders began to notice patterns that could no longer be explained away. Payloads were being reduced to improve survivability, routes were altered to avoid opposition, missions were canceled outright when conditions were unfavorable. The bomber existed on paper as a strategic asset. In the air, it functioned as a compromise. Axis planners had hoped the aircraft would close a gap to give Japan a capability it had never fully possessed. Instead, it exposed the gap more clearly. Every comparison with Allied bombers highlighted what was missing: power, durability, and margin. American aircraft did not merely outperform it, they demonstrated a different philosophy, one built on redundancy and industrial depth. Where Japan adapted and compromised, America redesigned and replaced. This contrast became impossible to ignore. As losses mounted and effectiveness declined, Japanese command faced a choice they had delayed for too long: continue investing in an aircraft that could not fulfill its intended role, or accept that the experiment had failed. The answer would shape not only the fate of this bomber, but Japan's broader understanding of how far adaptation could be pushed before it collapsed under its own weight. And as that understanding began to settle in, the aircraft was about to face the conditions that would remove all remaining doubt. The final confirmation came when the aircraft was asked to do what it had been purchased for in the first place: operate as a long-range bomber in a contested sky. As Allied air power expanded, the bomber's shortcomings became impossible to mask. Interception rates increased, enemy fighters closed the distance quickly, anti-aircraft fire grew denser around key targets. In these conditions, the aircraft's lack of speed and defensive strength proved fatal. Crews reported the same experience repeatedly. Once detected, escape was unlikely. Climb performance was insufficient to gain altitude advantage. Defensive guns lacked coverage and power. Structural limits prevented aggressive evasive maneuvers. The aircraft could neither outrun danger nor absorb it. Operational planners adjusted again. Bomb loads were reduced further, escort expectations were lowered, missions were reassigned to secondary roles where opposition was minimal. What had been envisioned as a strategic bomber was now treated as a liability to be protected rather than a weapon to be employed. This was the turning point. Japanese command finally acknowledged what American engineers had already concluded years earlier: the design was fundamentally unsuited to the role it had been forced to play. No amount of modification could compensate for an airframe and power plant never intended for sustained combat stress. The realization carried broader implications. It was not merely the failure of one aircraft, it was evidence that adaptation without industrial depth had limits. Buying what America had discarded did not grant access to American capability, it revealed the cost of lacking it. By the time this understanding took hold, resources had already been spent, crews had already been lost, and strategic opportunities had already passed. The bomber did not fail dramatically, it failed predictably, and in that failure, Japanese command confronted a truth that would echo across the remainder of the war. Some gaps could not be closed by urgency alone. As the aircraft was quietly withdrawn from frontline roles, the consequences of that realization began to reshape Japan's air strategy and set the stage for the aftermath that followed. Once the decision was made to withdraw the aircraft from its intended role, the consequences unfolded quietly but decisively. There was no announcement, no public admission of failure. Instead, the bomber simply appeared less often in operational plans. It was reassigned. Some airframes were converted to transport duties. Others were relegated to training roles or long-range patrols where opposition was light. In these environments, the aircraft's original strengths, range, and steady flight could still be exploited without exposing its weaknesses, but the strategic ambition that had justified its purchase was gone. Japanese planners now faced the reality that they did not possess a true heavy bomber force. The aircraft that was meant to bridge that gap had instead consumed resources without delivering capability. Time, materials, and manpower had been spent adapting a design that could never fully succeed. This realization carried psychological weight. The bomber had represented hope, a belief that Japan could shortcut years of development by adopting foreign designs. Its failure forced a reassessment of that belief. Adaptation could stretch limits, but it could not replace foundational industrial strength. Comparisons with Allied air power became increasingly stark. American bombers grew larger, faster, and more resilient. Losses were absorbed, designs evolved. New aircraft replaced old ones without hesitation. Japan could not afford that cycle. The failure of this aircraft did not decide the war, but it revealed the structural imbalance that would define it. Every future decision was shaped by scarcity rather than choice. Each compromise narrowed options further. As the war progressed, Japanese air strategy shifted away from ambition and toward necessity. Defensive roles expanded, long-range offensive dreams faded. Air power became reactive rather than decisive. The aircraft itself faded into obscurity, remembered more by those who maintained it and flew it than by official histories. Yet its legacy lingered in the decisions that followed.
It had shown more clearly than any report or analysis that buying what America had thrown away did not provide a substitute for what America could still build. And as that understanding settled in, the broader consequences of this miscalculation continued to unfold, reshaping Japan's air war in ways that extended far beyond a single failed bomber. As 1943 turned into 1944, the implications of that failure became more visible across Japan's broader air war. Without a reliable heavy bomber, Japan lacked the ability to strike deep, sustained blows against enemy industry or logistics. Strategic reach remained limited. Offensive air power narrowed. What replaced ambition was improvisation. Aircraft originally designed for one role were reassigned to others. Medium bombers were stretched beyond their intended range. Crews flew longer missions with fewer margins. Losses mounted not from dramatic defeats, but from accumulated strain. The failed bomber stood as a cautionary example inside Japanese planning circles. Engineers became more cautious, commanders less optimistic. The belief that foreign designs could be adapted quickly to solve systemic problems weakened. Meanwhile, Allied air power expanded relentlessly. American production lines turned out aircraft at a pace Japan could not match. When a design underperformed, it was replaced. When losses occurred, they were absorbed. Airframes improved, engines grew more powerful, bomb loads increased. Japan faced this expansion without an answer. The bomber that had once promised reach and parity had instead consumed precious time. Its failure left a gap that could no longer be filled. By the time Japan accepted this reality, the war had moved beyond the point where a single aircraft or even a single program could alter its course. In retrospect, the aircraft's greatest impact was not in what it achieved, but in what it revealed. It exposed the limits of adaptation under constraint. It demonstrated that aviation success depended not only on design, but on the ability to abandon failure and begin again. Japan could not afford to abandon failure. As Allied aircraft dominated the skies, the lessons of that early purchase echoed through every subsequent decision. Air power became defensive, reactive, and increasingly desperate. The bomber disappeared quietly, but its legacy remained embedded in Japan's strategic posture, an enduring reminder that some shortcuts lead not to progress, but to delay. And with that understanding firmly in place, the story of this aircraft moves beyond its operational life toward reflection on what it ultimately meant for the war, and for the limits of ambition under pressure. The failure of this aircraft did not unfold as a single dramatic moment. It revealed itself slowly, through limits that could not be engineered away, and compromises that multiplied rather than resolved. What Japan had purchased was not a flawed idea, but a design shaped for a world that no longer existed. American manufacturers had rejected the aircraft because they could afford to. Their industrial system allowed experimentation, failure, and replacement. When a design did not meet expectations, it was discarded without consequence. Japan, operating under scarcity and urgency, could not make the same choice. That difference mattered. By adapting what America had thrown away, Japan did not inherit American capability. It inherited American compromise, without the industrial depth that made compromise survivable. Every modification fought the aircraft's original purpose. Every mission exposed the cost of forcing civilian design into military reality. The lesson extended beyond one bomber. Modern warfare demanded not only innovation, but the freedom to abandon failure. It required systems that could absorb loss, replace mistakes, and move forward without hesitation. Japan lacked that flexibility, and the aircraft made that lack visible in the most unforgiving way, through repeated disappointment rather than sudden collapse. The bomber's legacy is not measured in targets destroyed or missions completed. It lies in what it revealed about limits of industry, of adaptation, and of ambition under pressure. In the skies of the Second World War, success belonged not to those who adapted fastest, but to those who could start over without fear of waste. Japan could not, and in buying what America had already discarded, Japan laid a truth that echoed across the remainder of the war. Some designs fail quietly, but the reasons they fail can shape history long after they leave the sky.